continue this, let's say, open specification mindset track with Carol Russer, who is a VP and CEO at SAP Concur, and she will be talking with us about the consumer mindset around the APIs. So yes, we build specs and standards and specifications, but for what? For the consumer mindset. Hello, Carol. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, I invite you to share your slide. We're really glad to have you. And let's talk about the why of this, the consumer mindset around APIs. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it. So this, it's pretty funny. I wrote my first API many years ago, so I'm dating myself a bit. Actually, back in the mainframe days, and I didn't quite realize at the time in my early 20s exactly what I was doing in the grand scheme of things. And then over the years, of course, in the last 5 or 6 years, especially with microservices, it's been interesting to sort of circle back around and see how the industry thinks about APIs and approaches APIs. And so my focus today is to talk about the challenges of APIs that are built without the consumer mindset and offer you some ideas based on my experience on how to address that. And like I mentioned, it's an industry-wide challenge. We have engineers, product teams building APIs for everything. So if you have a microservice, you should have APIs as we make that shift. But is that really the right approach? If the consumer is not considered, will the API be useful? Why did we build it? Is it being designed with the appropriate intention so that it actually provides value? And the takeaway for today, and my intention, is to make sure that you understand the consumer mindset about APIs and why it is important. The difference between what I call a consumer and a stakeholder and why it matters. And then an introduction to why guiding or governing principles are important to an API success model. And so let's dive right into it. First of all, let's talk about the consumer mindset and why APIs are important. So I used to give this talk in a slightly different way, more about me speaking to very specific items and elements and what we should do. And what I have learned over time is it's really more effective to present in a question format so that folks who are interested in understanding the topic can really think about and take the questions back to where they are today and apply those, right? And ask those same questions in their environment. So questions that I like to ask, and I'll give some context to each one of these. How would you define who the consumer of your APIs are, right? And so we have a lot of different approaches and people and personas involved when it comes to APIs. Do your teams engage directly with the API consumer or with a stakeholder who represents the consumer? For example, an API consumer could be a client, right? So maybe you have a product and the clients use the APIs maybe to extend your product, right? Or maybe sometimes in some cases to get data, right, from the product for whatever they're doing, especially in a software service environment. Or an API stakeholder. So maybe it's a stakeholder, maybe it's the folks, the business development team, right, who represents the stakeholder, or an alliances team internally within your company. So when you think about consumers and stakeholders, there's really a broad set of personas out there other than the developer, who is obviously a stakeholder as well. Would you agree or disagree with APIs being part of the SDLC, the software delivery lifecycle? Does your organization treat APIs as a product? As we just heard in the previous conversation, one of the questions that came up was around versioning, right? API versioning. It's really critical, right, that we take that into consideration as part of our guiding principles when building APIs, but there's a life cycle to it, right? So if we were to treat APIs as a product, right, we would have a full life cycle, just like we would with a customer or an actual product that we put in production. During API conceptualization, so just the sheer thought that pops into your mind about building an API, do your product teams engage those stakeholders or those consumers, right, to bring in that input and make sure that the value is being there? What challenges are you facing today when APIs are built without the consumer in mind? And so what are those challenges that may be happening? And I can give you specific examples, probably talk through 20 solid minutes about examples of these, but APIs without pagination or filtering. It's really challenging for a partner, for example, or a situation where pagination or filtering is handled differently by various teams if your partners are trying to interact with different products, right, and bring the data together across your different products, and now you're having to interact with the APIs in a different way. And that can be really challenging because the consumer, the person who's on the other end of that trying to pull that information in. So your takeaway, just keep the consumer in mind when you're building APIs. And then let's talk a little bit more about what does she mean by consumer and stakeholder. This is really confusing, and I can certainly understand that. Let me give you a little bit about the context of where I'm coming from. So the company that I work for, we produce enterprise software, right? So we're not Slack, we're not Facebook. We are building software that corporations consume, right? And so that corporation has many different personas across the board, and there are tens of thousands of customers, right? So why do they need APIs? Who uses them? And what are they trying to do? And I would say most of the time, in our case, they would be trying to extend our solutions. And if you take just a simple solution, say you have a travel solution and an expense product, or a travel product and expense product. So that's our specialty, travel and expense. But our specialty is not the surrounding business processes or compliance that may be wrapped around the spending of the money, right? And so the taxes or being able to grab that information and tie it back into your back-end systems, and then learn from that data and figure out if you're having any compliance situations or scenarios. Well, that's not really the specialty. And so clients and partners may want to extend that software. And so how do we make it easy for them to do that? And how do we make it easy for them to do that across our suite of products, not just, one or two? And that's really hard, because if we deliver our org chart, right, that it makes it really complicated if we're not looking across the products or taking the consumer or the stakeholder in mind. And so I'm going to show you just a really brief example of, if you look at what I would call current models that I have seen across a few different companies where I have worked. You have your APIs, so you have the technology, a very technology driven big set of APIs, potentially across multiple products, built potentially, one or more APIs across microservices or individual microservices. But we have a lot of different consumers, right, based on the example that I just gave when it comes to enterprise software. So how do you make sure that all of these APIs that are being built, and then you have a partner or a client who needs to now navigate across potentially thousands of APIs or hundreds of APIs, how do they tie that together and orchestrate it into a solution? And then what if those APIs are built differently, potentially with different guidelines and versionings, and it really can become complex. But there is the potential in the model that you can put in place if you're thinking about the consumer and you're putting yourself in the position of the companies who are trying to consume your APIs. And so if you made a shift, and this is just a proposed idea that I've been putting in place across the board when I give these talks, is shifting from that technology-driven innovation to the consumer or the value-based innovation. And so just a pictorial view, sure, you still have your APIs and services and maybe your layers of platform wrapped around it, and then your product and innovation, maybe an API program. But then you have those stakeholders, right, who are representing maybe the clients or the different partners, and then the actual consumers of the APIs. And so if you come into approaching APIs as a product and actually treat it using product management 101, then you're shifting the use and the value conversation over to the left, right? And you're thinking about that up front. And in some cases, the consumer could be an internal development team, right? If you're building platform-based APIs. So it could be internal, could be external, could be public, could be private, but you really need to pull all that together up front before we go too far down the line. And so that's what when I talk about consumers and stakeholders, the business development team, the marketing teams, the administrators, the people who are using your products, those are the personas, right, that need to be considered. And so the takeaway here is just, giving those examples of why it's important as an engineer, as a product person, to have those conversations up front, and maybe even consider looking at it an extension of that. Maybe it's beyond that. Maybe it's beyond APIs as a product. Maybe it's platform as a product. Whatever the spin or whatever terminology is, because platform is probably somewhat of an overused word. Make sure that you're having those conversations earlier in the discussion. And so a little bit about guiding principles and why, or I say guiding governing principles, and why those are important to a successful API program or API success model. That's the term. I like to put success in there because when you use the word governing, I don't know, like when I was a developer, it can feel a little, you want to shy away from that. Like, I don't want you to tell me what to do. I want to be a developer because I want to be creative, but you have to have principles in place, especially in the enterprise software world and when it comes to APIs. And so there are so many books and articles out there about API design standards. Again, using that same approach as I used at the beginning, asking these questions in your company or where you work or, whatever you're doing, what has been your experience following the standards and practices? Do you get positive feedback, right, from your product and engineering teams on either the design standards you have in place, or maybe you don't have any at all, or maybe every product that you have has a different design standard, which I have witnessed. I have actually done a discovery before at a company where there were 6 different design standards, and well, then why your consumers and your clients and partners are very confused when they're trying to use those APIs. Does your company have internal versus public versus private APIs, and what in the world does that mean, right? And it could be the mechanism by which you choose to publish the API. So you build the API, you've built it with a consumer mindset in mind. Every API that you build, right, should be extensible. You should be able to extend it and offer it to for the public use, right? Whether it be your clients or your partners. But maybe there are situations where you want to keep it private. Maybe there's a limited use case, and it's not an API that would be exposed publicly, or maybe it's just built for internal purposes, right, where it needs to be used. So those types of things, breaking down those definitions and knowing what practices to apply are important. Do you have disparate product teams who own APIs? Right. And so if you have many microservices, if you have multiple products in the suite of products that your company may sell, are they using do you have those different teams? And then what are the challenges that you face today across with consistency, security, reliability? Again, going back to these governing principles. Another question to ask is, how does your organization manage changes to APIs? So we just heard about that in the previous discussion. Versioning, right? What is the approach? What do we do? What if you have a product that's been in production for 15, 20 years, right, in enterprise software, and you've got APIs that have been built for the last 10 or 12, what do? They've been using these APIs. You have versioning. You need to have control. Every time you change an API, it could effectively be affecting thousands of clients. And then how do you move them from the old over to the new for the various reasons? So the versioning principles and the guidelines and deprecation policies are super important. And then how do you measure success of your API program from a maturity level? How do you look at that? How do you know where you are today and where you want to be, and then the paths to get there, which is often scoped into a capability maturity model, like people, process, and technology. So your takeaway here in the sharing of this information is to keep guidelines and consumers top of mind, for API success. And so I put this in here to give a visual to what I talk about when I refer to a maturity model. I did a ton of research probably about 5 years ago on, what it's a struggle. It's a struggle sometimes when we've built APIs somewhat ad hoc, maybe over the years. It's the next best thing to do, but then how do you recover from that if maybe it's gotten out of hand? And so this is an example of a maturity model I put together over just a lot of different research. You can see my sources up on the left-hand side, and applied just a regular CMM approach to it across the people, process, and technology. So how would you measure yourself, and then where do you want to go? Maybe it's not as important for the APIs that you build that the process is in place. Maybe your company's small enough that you can keep that fairly well set. But in other enterprise software companies, it's really important, right? We need to have those controls in place, and when we make changes or when we make decisions to build APIs, it's a life cycle from beginning to end, right? When you may choose to decommission an API, and it can take years. It can take years to make that shift. So this becomes super important in that context. And so overall, the takeaway that I would like for you to have is, you can use these questions yourself. With your company, you're thinking about those different components around the consumer mindset and why APIs are, why it's important to have the consumer mindset when building APIs, understanding the difference between a consumer and a stakeholder, and why does that even matter? I know as a developer, and I work with engineers every single day, we have something to do, we go in, we build the API, or even within the product teams. But are we thinking about how it's being consumed, even in technology, right? How I go in and have to authenticate as a partner to be able to get access to a client, and is that easy for me to do, and how do I navigate that? And just really thinking about the consumption side of navigating APIs in your developer portal. I mean, the whole thing, right? Wrapping it in there. And then those governing principles towards the end. Why is that important? What is your API success model overall? And so I hope this has been helpful. I know it's a fairly quick talk. My name is Carol Russell, and like I said, I've been doing this a long time, and I appreciate your time, and I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carol. So the first question is like the same question I asked this morning to Chet Kapoor is like, when in your mindset, let's say, or at least in your mind, but we've shifted from the word integration to consumption. For me, it's like we're in the API product mindset has been there. So did you identify it in the past? How do you see it?
I think it depends on whether or not you're applying a business model to it, actually, right? Like there are problems that we need to solve to be able to connect systems together, right? So maybe we need an API simply for an integration, right? Literally, we're just building it to tie two services together. That's one business reason. That's the value, right, of that API and what you're doing. But when you talk about consumption-based and the consumer, you may have a business model in place. Maybe your business model from a business development and sales perspective is, I can offer the ability to extend our products, but I want to make sure that for the entire usage of this API or this set of APIs or this product, for a partner, for example, to come in and extend the product, maybe we want to charge based on that consumption. So what is the business model? What is it we're really trying to do in the end? And so I think the answer to that question to me is sort of going back to the purpose of this presentation. What's the consumer? What's the purpose? What's the value that you're bringing to the table? And if there's a business model wrapped around it from a consumption standpoint, then that's part of what you're taking into consideration when you build the API itself or the program that's wrapped around it.
Yeah, I really love this idea. When there is a business model, it's consumption, it should be a product. When it's just for making things works, it's a more technical approach and integration. I really like this idea. One question also do you make a difference between the consumer and the customer about APIs?
So it depends, and that's why I tell you what, I actually struggled with this over time, trying to figure out how to take something. I mean, it's somewhat of a complex topic overall, and when every company, every product has a journey to their current state. And so a product, for example, like the ones that I deal with, they've been in production for many, many years. If I'm building a new product, I may have a different state to which I am coming to that. And so I think, answering any of these questions to me is about what's your current state, where are you in this journey, and where do you plan on going in this journey, and then you can kind of figure out how to navigate it, because we're not all the same. You see what I mean? Like it's not a one size fits all. It's about knowing what are all the touch points that you need to be thinking about in order to be successful, right? And I think that changes because it's different. Every journey to that current state is going to be different. I don't know if I answered that question, but
No, yeah, it is. I really loved your maturity model, like the different steps. I tried to screenshot it. I didn't want to wait for the video to be able to analyze it better. But the thing is, how do you align the IT maturity and the business maturity on all of these steps? Can one go before the other, or no? It has to be both in the same time for every maturity level.
it depends. Again, right? If I were starting from scratch and I had a fresh slate, right? I would just like, I don't know if you've ever seen there's several like YouTube videos out there with around technology, but if I were starting with a fresh slate, I would completely start value driven, right? I can build a lot of APIs, right? We know how to build APIs, but if I don't really have a purpose of what I'm going to do with them, then technology driven innovation, because someone has to consume that API, just seems very backwards to me. If I start with consumer-driven innovation, and keep in mind, the consumer could be other developers. If you're building like platform-based APIs, the consumer could be an actual user, right, of a product. The consumer could be a company, and that company is using software to solve some back-end problems. And so it just depends, right? And I think that's the key. Is asking those questions. That's why I shifted this presentation to a question-based, think about these, ask yourself these questions to figure out what makes the most sense.
Yeah, I totally agree and understand. So maybe the last question, preparing the talk we have right after. Let's say consumers. The relationship with consumers is most of the time based on branding and trust. Brand is representation of the trust we put in a relationship between two entities, companies, supplier customer relationship. What would you advise to keep that trust for consumers and for API consumers? Like, what would be your let's say bullet points, elements to enhance that trust?
So I think there are a couple of things. One is, keeping in mind, I'm thinking from a pretty big corporation standpoint. You have to have data privacy, data concerns, legal. In my opinion, you need to have, if you follow, if your company is the size where you need to follow international standards, compliance standards, DPP, GDPR, like, when you're dealing with partners. And so if your product is taking in clients' data, right, and you're storing that data, and then a partner is going to come use that data, and you have a contract between the partner and the client, and then there's the third piece, who's housing that data, right? There's this triangulation. So you have to have the right legal practices and data privacy practices and contracts in place to make those agreements successful and everyone's being protected. And so that, to me, is a level of trust. And then when you build those APIs, right, you need to apply proper security principles, which we just heard in the previous talk. And that's another reason those governing components are super important, right, to be able to have that trust in place. And if you do go through ISO 9001 or 27001 about how you build your software, and that stamp is what you've committed to your clients, then you have to have the right controls in place along the way. did you have the consumer? Do you have an SDLC in place? Are you having those checkpoints? Are you making sure that you're not sharing data, right, that shouldn't be shared? And so when I think of trust, right, I think of from all the way from the customer, partner, the client, and then the engineering side. So I see it from both sides, the business and the technology side.
Yeah, we've heard business, technology, regulatory environment, compliance, value. We heard a lot of points here. And I think this is exactly what we will develop with the next panel. Thank you very much, Carol, for being with us. Yeah, it was great. And we'd love to have you again at other APIdays conferences.
Love to. It's fantastic. Love sharing the information.